or now? No?
Now host.
Now I'm host. Wonderful. Okay, so welcome everybody to this first round of discussion on Kreativkollektiv Ehrenfeld, and I'm very happy to kick it off with such an important and interesting topic: post-growth, degrowth, green growth. I don't really know what the difference is, and I guess we learned that today from Daniele. Daniele is a researcher at the German Development Institute, which is a think tank that works on development issues. And he himself is an economist by training and has worked on various issues of social and economic transformation and development, and always kind of with a linkage to climate change and the economy. And I'm very happy, Daniele, that you agreed to give this talk or input today and share your thoughts and your wisdom, right? I don't want to raise really high expectations, but yeah, it's really nice that you take your time to share all of those things with us today. And so we have thought about the following structure. We'll start with an input by Daniele of about 10 to 15 minutes. To give us some background on the concepts, on how those concepts were developed, to kind of have like a good basis to discuss on. Then we open up for the first time for discussions for about 20 minutes. And then we get another input by Daniele on more practical implementation of post-growth policies worldwide, but also specifically in the German context. And after that, we'll open up again for about, I hope, 30 minutes, if we have that left then, to perhaps, discuss it, ask questions, but potentially also come up with some interesting pathways to take a step further. So we have, I don't know how many people here in Zoom right now, but at the same time, as Christian said, we have this live stream on YouTube and Twitch. So you have those ones that are here in the Zoom have the opportunity to comment and ask questions live when we open up. And I'll try to moderate that. Please mute yourself when you don't interact with us. And the ones that are on YouTube and on Twitch, you can use the function to type in your questions and comments, and Christian is so nice to kind of collect those, and then at one point we'll feed that into the discussion here as well, or we try to. Yeah, if there are any things in between, just raise your hand in Zoom, and I'll try to kind of give you the space then. So I hope I did not forget anything. So I hope, yeah, we just kick it off now, and I give the floor to Daniele.
Okay.
I guess it's going to be very interesting, and I'll mute myself now.
Okay. I wish I could do that in the office as well.
The muting part.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jana and Christian, for having me. And I think what you're doing is a great initiative. I also want to apologize for not speaking in German. I'm doing my best during the lockdown to maximize and watch as many Tatort episodes as I can, but I guess I'm not at the level I can talk about these topics in German. So the idea of this conversation more than lecture is to discuss whether what we're living at the moment can lead to actually very big changes in the way we live and how our societies are structured. And if one of these alternatives can be post-growth. So wait a second, it's not working. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to introduce 3 main points, and then I hope that we can have a very fruitful discussion. So I want to introduce the concept of degrowth and where this concept origins. Then I want to, as Jana said, I want to look how degrowth means in practice. So which policies are advocated by degrowth. And then finally, I want to elaborate more on the issue that the coronavirus situation that we're living at the moment can be actually, can give a big push towards post-growth and degrowth societies. So let's talk what degrowth is, and I will just explain some of the basic concepts. Sorry if this is maybe too elementary, but I mean, feel free then to ask any questions afterwards. So the degrowth discourse starts, as many as you know, from the environmental problem that we have at the moment. And the fact that by 2050, we need to reduce our emissions to zero. So in the graph, we can see that as we are now, we are projected to go to increase our temperatures by 4 degrees, which is the gray area. While if we look at the current policies and the policies that are actually planned for, which is the blue sort of area and lines, we see that the increase in temperatures will be around 3 degrees, which is too much. While the green one is what we are really aiming for, which means an increase of maximum 1.5 degrees, which means, as I said, that by 2050, net emissions have to be equal to zero. Now, the issue is, how do we achieve these environmental targets that we have? So there are two main streams of thought and two main macro policy options that are out there. One is degrowth or post-growth, and one is green growth. And I will explain or point out the main points of both these macro theories. Now, one thing I also want to say is that in the presentation, I will use the term degrowth instead of post-growth. And I mean, post-growth is related to with many terms. There is A-growth, steady state economy, and degrowth. I use the term degrowth because the one that is mostly used and is the one that has been more developed. But the concepts of degrowth are shared by also the other post-growth theories. And the other caveat I want to make sure is that when I talk about degrowth, I mainly, or the literature mainly, growth in Western nations with poorer nations at the end of the presentation.
So Daniele.
They put a lot of.
Daniele, I think we did not hear you for the past, right? I think, yeah. For the past, I don't know, when you stopped with the last point on that slide.
This one here.
No, the previous one.
The last point.
Yes.
So yes, and the last point I was just saying that the degrowth presentation refers mainly to countries as Germany and not low-income countries, and I will come back to this point at the end of the presentation. So here I was starting to describe where green growth comes from, and it comes mainly from a group of Asian countries that use this concept after the 2008 financial crisis, as they adopted a lot of green measures in their expansionary policies after the crisis. Now, the issue is that compared to degrowth, green growth is even a more kind of nuanced concept, in a way that there is no agreed definition. I put here the definition that you use from the OECD, but I think all the definitions have two things in common. First, they are absolutely clear on the fact that we need economic growth, as you can see in this definition. And the second point is they are very ambiguous of what they mean by green. So here they are very general, but they say that natural resources need to continue to provide the resource and environmental services, but they don't really, they're not very clear, and they use this unclarity to kind of prioritize growth. Most importantly, the two main assumptions that underline green growth are, first of all, that technological change will make production more efficient. So basically, new technology will save us and will save the environment. So the more we grow, the better technologies we have, and the more the environment will improve. And the second assumption that they have is that the richer we become, so the more growth we are, the more we will consume in an environmentally friendly way. So we will use more services instead of more kind of manufacturing products. And these are the 2 points that that green growth advocates point towards. Now, the most important question is, are these hypotheses realistic, and is green growth actually possible? So what you put in this figure is what happened to GDP and CO2 emissions since 2000. As you can see, the purple line shows that GDP has increased much more than energy and CO2 emissions since 2000. And this shows that two things. The first of all, that there has been a bit of decoupling in a sense that GDP has grown more than CO2 emissions and energy use. But we did not have absolute decoupling, which is what we need, as we need to go to net zero emission by 2050. Because as you can see, both CO2 emissions and energy have increased basically by 1.5 times since 2000. So this means that globally, we do not observe absolute decoupling that we need, but we just observe relative decoupling. Now, the green growth funds will tell you that actually absolute decoupling has been happening. And indeed, in these graphs, you can see that, for example, in the US and in Europe, also absolute emissions have decreased since the 90s. But there are two important things here to consider. The first one is that the increase in emissions has actually been very small. So, for example, Europe has decreased emissions by less than 1% per year, while what we need now is at least 8% per year. So the reduction are insufficient compared to what we need. And the second issue is that you can see that each country has two lines. The continuous line is territorial emissions, which means what a country emits in its borders through its production. And the dotted line is what we call consumption emissions. So it's the emissions that arise from one's consumption, which include the production that happened within our countries, but also the production that happened in other countries to produce the goods that we consume at the end. And as you can see, for Europe, for the US, and generally for all very high income countries, the consumption emissions are much higher, while, for example, for China and India, the consumption emissions are much lower than territorial emissions. So when people say that actually emissions have decreased, you always have to take into account that the size was not enough and that consumption emissions are much higher than territorial emissions. Now, apart from these huge problems, there are also other issues with green growth. So the first one is that in a lot of models and scenarios that you hear from the news, from the UN, these models make a huge use of carbon capture and storage systems, which are technologies that are meant to suck the emissions or all the pollution from the atmosphere. And this is a big concern because these technologies are not available. We don't know if they will be available, and most importantly, if they will be available, they will probably not be available at a scale that we need. And this is crucial because they impact a lot the scenarios that we base our policies upon. And another issue is that actually also when we look at the renewable energies, we think about just the power. But actually what is more important is how we build renewable energy systems. And for example, there was a report recently that was submitted to the UK government that showed that we have to rebuild all the UK cars using electric cars. We will use basically 2 times the annual world cobalt production. So which means that we can have good energy, but actually the materials that we need to build renewable energy will actually destroy the environment. So not just the power, but also how we build renewables. And then at the last point, which brings me to the issue of post-growth, is having said all these negative aspects or like negative signs about green growth, the question is growth actually necessary, especially for rich countries like Germany, to enhance our welfare? So from this question now we go to degrowth. So one important thing is the definition of degrowth, as it leads to a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what degrowth is. So the official definition of degrowth is what I put here, which is an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions. So there are some points that we need to clarify. The first thing is degrowth is not the same as a recession. So we're not saying that we'll make our economy go into a recession. First of all, it's a deliberate downscaling on production and consumption. So what it means that we plan and we aim to kind of downscale production and consumption. And the second thing is that it's a sustainable process and it's sufficiency oriented. So we're not saying that we will degrowth until 0, but we will degrowth until a level where we still have very high well-being. And more importantly, and this is, I think, the reason why there is a lot of misunderstanding about degrowth. There are the two hypotheses at the bottom of degrowth. The first one is actually about the name. So the reason why it's called degrowth is not because of a degrowth of GDP, but because of a degrowth of ecological arm of environmental pressure. And the issue is that the degrowers say that if you downscale production and consumption, then you will necessarily have to descale also the GDP. So the issue that we have a degrowth in GDP is just a consequence of the degrowth in ecological pressure. It's not the primary target. And the second hypothesis is that, as I was saying before, we actually don't need as much or continuous economic growth to achieve prosperity. And I want to show you two examples that are usually put on by degrowth advocates. So this is what is called Easterlin paradox. I don't know if you heard about it. And it's basically the relationship between happiness, which you can see in this graph on the vertical axis, and GDP per capita on the horizontal axis. So the point here is that it is true that GDP increases happiness up to a certain point, but you can see after around $30,000 per capita, you can see that actually the change in happiness is not that big. So increasing growth doesn't lead to a much higher change in increase in happiness. The second example, which is probably the one that is most relevant at the moment, is about GDP and life expectancy, or GDP and health more generally. You can see that the picture here is even more striking. So up to around $15,000 GDP per capita, you can see that there is actually a very strong correlation between GDP and life expectancy. On the other hand, after that threshold, you see that increases in GDP don't really correlate with increasing in life expectancy. And of course, the example that everybody makes, or the case that everybody points to, the United States, which you can see in the graph, is the last dot to the right, which means that it has the highest income, but actually has the same life expectancy of countries which are 1/3 of their GDP per capita. So basically, with these two graphs, I just want to show you that this is kind of empirical basis to degrowth, to show that you can actually achieve high well-being also without growing continuously, but find a point where you still reach high well-being without destroying the environment. So now the question is, if this is true, and then you can achieve high well-being by growing less, can we actually achieve degrowth? So degrowth is starting to be more accepted into political institutions and research. And I think one of the biggest achievements was that in the latest UN report on climate change, there was for the first time a scenario that recognizes the need to degrowth. And in particular, this scenario models a global energy demand that decreases by 40% by 2050. So I put in this graph the two different examples. So on the left one, you have a typical scenario for these UN models. And you can see that the yellow portion of the figure on the left shows what I was referring to before as carbon capture storage. So you can see that the usual scenarios make us consume more emissions, because then we have these technologies that suck down the emissions and the pollutions from the environment. On the other hand, you have on the right, the LED, so the low energy demand scenario, which is this new scenario, which shows that actually we emit less energy and less emissions, because we don't have to then rely on this carbon capture and storage technologies. And this, it seems a very small difference, but actually it's a huge achievement, and especially being recognized in these UN reports is a great step forward. So I wanted then to just finish this talk about the first part of the talk about degrowth, just looking at a bit the history of degrowth. So degrowth is not something has been conceptualized very well in the last 10, 15 years, but it's actually something that has its roots in the last couple, 2-3 centuries. So someone says that degrowth actually started with Malthus. I strongly oppose this because I actually think that Malthus was in favor of continuous economic growth. And if you want, we can discuss about this later. So I tend to disagree on this topic, but I just want to present the issue. More importantly, the real kind of political opening to degrowth was with the landscape report Limits to Growth in 1972. And it was the first time that this researcher published some scenarios on how limited are natural resources and the fact that if we continue to grow, we will not be able to keep the world as it is. And of course, this report was very much discussed and its findings were rejected by a lot of countries and especially by the growth agenda. And they came out in the 80s with a new report which pushed the idea of what's the environmental goodness curve, which says that we need growth because yes, at the beginning, higher growth increases the environmental pressure. So the environment worsens at the beginning. But when countries become very rich, then we get to a turning point. So higher economic growth actually improves the environment. And this is very disputed because the empirical basis is very much flawed. And there are a lot of analyses that show that actually this curve does not exist in practice, especially for CO2 emissions. But it was something that the neoliberalists and the Washington Consensus were trying to push in order to kind of give an understanding and a reason to continue to pursue the growth agenda. And then finally, there are the Sustainable Development Goals. Some say that degrowth enters there. I'm again not very convinced, but it's very much open discussion. And then, just before we take some questions or start discussing, it's important to recognize also that degrowth also feeds into different development models and research streams. The main ones are 4. So we have ecological economics, which says that the ecology and environment is one thing with societal outcomes. Then we have sustainable consumption studies that says basically we need to improve our consumption and make it much more sustainable. Otherwise, we don't have a chance to stay within planetary boundaries. And then we have 2 streams that are a bit more sociological, which are the French political ecology and post-development studies that basically try to propose different types of societies that relate more to GDP growth, but are more kind of convivial and social development models. So I think this was it at the moment, and I'm looking forward to some discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniele. I think that was great to get a first understanding. At least I now understood what the difference between degrowth or post-growth and green growth is. And I would suggest that we start by taking some clarification questions. So if there are things that people did not understand, but think that they're relevant to be understood first to engage in the discussion, please raise your hands or write them in the chat. And we'll try to collect that. And after that, we would have a round of more content-wise questions and comments, I'd say. So in case you have questions, can I see everybody? Yes, I do. And do I see any hands? Any clarification questions by anybody? You all understood? Ah, no, there's one hand, Marion. Then I would suggest, Marion, you go ahead. You're muted, so yes, unmute yourself.
Yes, and I also switch on my video.
Perfect.
So there's also a research area which is called feminist economics, isn't it? And it somehow fits into degrowth, and I don't know how. So maybe you can let us know then, Hile.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps you can collect if there are any other ones that have clarification questions. Raise your hand. Okay, there is none. Then I would have one. Perhaps I missed it. But could you explain again what decoupling is?
Mm-hmm.
And Karen?
Hi, yeah, we were just wondering, could you elaborate again what exactly is territorial emission? Maybe we also just didn't get it in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to have a second look at the graph that related GDP and life expectancy, because I was wondering, does this really contain all the countries? And maybe you could elaborate a bit more. Yeah, I wonder if there's any information missing in the variables here that we should discuss more. I mean, it seems very impressive as a graph. Yeah, but I would like to have a second look. Thanks.
Are there other questions, or shall I start?
I think those are the questions, and then the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll start with the coupling part. So the coupling means that GDP and emissions don't grow at the same rate. So it means that GDP grows more or less than emissions. And so in this case, for example, there is a decoupling in a way that GDP grows more than CO2 emissions. So the purple line grows more than the two green lines. But the decoupling is relative. It means that they are both growing. It's just that GDP grows more than energy and CO2. An absolute decoupling would mean that GDP grows and CO2 decreases. So that would be absolute decoupling. And this is what we need, or at least what we need is reducing CO2 emissions. So in this case, it's relative because they are both growing, but one is growing more than the other. So that was the decoupling thing. Then the question about emissions, territorial emissions, let me go back. Okay, so this is the graph. So as I said, the territorial emissions are the one on top and are the continuous line, and the consumption's emissions are the dotted ones. So basically what you hear usually in the news is about territorial emissions. So how much Germany has emitted or how much Italy has emitted in terms of national boundaries. The difference with consumption emissions is, for example, if I'm in the US consumers, let's say that they consume all what is produced in the US, but they also consume some part that is what is consumed in China, for example. So that counts in consumption emissions, which will be the sum of all territorial emissions, plus the sum of the territorial emissions in China that are used to produce goods that then American people consume. And this sense is the other way around for China. For example, the issue that for China, territorial emissions are higher than consumption emission is that a lot of the production in China is then sent to the US. So actually Chinese people do not consume all what is produced in China. And that's why the consumption emissions in China are lower than the territorial emissions. But if you need also more kind of clarification, just let me know. And going to the graph, let me see again. Here, I think, I mean, there are different graphs. To be honest, I used this one because it was the highest quality, but I guess there are all the countries, and also similar graphs are basically give the same the same reasoning. They basically all show that until a certain point, you have a very strong relationship between increases in growth and life expectancy. And after a while, the increase that you have in life expectancy are zero or totally uncorrelated with increase in economic growth. So the point is that the US has the same life expectancy with 45,000 GDP per capita than, for example, Chile, which has less than 15. And this is something that also you probably find on other examples. And the similar thing, even though a bit less extreme, was found for the Easterlin paradox. One thing actually I didn't say is that sometimes people use logarithms instead of, so here we use absolute values. Sometimes people use logarithms which differ from this type of figure because they show percentage increases. And this is critical for degrowth, because with degrowth and with environmental limits, we're talking about absolute environmental limits. So talking about percentage changes does not take into account the absolute increase in GDP and environmental damage. And that's why I use here GDP per capita in absolute terms instead of logarithmic terms. I know this is a bit complicated, but again, I'm happy to clarify more. I see Jana is laughing, so okay. And the last point was about gender issues, right?
Feminist economics.
Feminist economists. Actually, I had a slide that I did not put inside here that says that degrowth includes 5 different perspectives. Some of them I've touched upon. One is the conservative one, so limits to growth. The second one is a social reformist perspective. The third is sufficiency. The fourth is, of course, an anti-capitalist perspective. And the fifth one is actually a feminist perspective, which is more kind of theorized in a way that they want to, that this new kind of development model is totally enhances gender parity. But I have to say that as we see later, that the policy proposals do not take, I think, fully this into account. But I just want to say that one of the pillars of the growth is feminist and gender parity. I know it's not a very good answer, but it's a very ambiguous concept also in between degrowers. So they just want a gender-just future. This is what they say.
Marion seems to be satisfied. The others, I hope, as well. I'd like to move to more content-related questions or comments by everybody. I mean, I noted quite some, but I'll give the floor to all others first. So please either use the chat to put them in there or raise your hand now. And I mean, I know that we have quite a diverse audience, and some of it was very specific, even though Daniele, I think, does his very best to explain it in very simple terms. But so just, you can also always just ask very, for you, seemingly simple questions, but they sometimes bring up a very, very interesting discussion. So
I promise you also the next part is much more exciting and practically relevant.
Exactly.
I have a question. I don't know how to raise the hand, actually.
You can
down there
in the...
like this?
Yes, no,
okay.
not.
Hey,
but
thank you for your
it's
talk.
fine.
Very nice. I have one question. So you showed like these actually also this report of Club of Rome from the 70s. Mm-hmm. So degrowth is actually like also already like a metaphor like 50 years. And I mean, it's still a concept which is coming up like over the last decades. And I would be interested, I mean, do you have like, I mean, we are still like in an, or do you say like the politics are still aiming like to increase like or to grow still like on the in the system. So what would you say, what are like crucial elements that have to take place that we actually allow to degrowth?
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you mean from a policy point of view?
Yeah, from a policy point of view.
Okay, so basically, just to answer your question, we'll see now in the next slides. I will outline some policy options or the policies that are pushed by degrowers.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's getting a lot more practical. Any other questions or comments? then I'll just use the floor and ask my own questions and comments. So I'd like to hear your opinion. Okay, there are some, but now I'll start off with at least one. How is your opinion on realizing that in a globalized world, where we kind of, I would imagine, have to find some joint way forward? Or is it possible if only some countries move ahead? So it's difficult for me to imagine if only some countries do it and some others continue their pathway. How does that relate to growth, to inequalities that will be generated? So I'd like to hear your opinion on that. And then I have a kind of raised hand by Ami and Thomas.
Hi, thank you, Jana. I got very basic questions. Sorry, very sorry to bother you with that. But I got a little bit confused about the goals, the overall goals of all the theories. I mean, you mentioned GDP and economical growth, and then there's green growth combined with ecological well-being and nature, and then there's also human well-being and death rates. And so is there some kind of ranking, or which goals are more pure than others? And I would be very interested in hearing of some like good models, good examples, other countries that do well, because here in Bonn, I mean, most people, when you live here, you live like in the green bubble. You feel like everyone is a good person and tries his best to like not use plastic or whatever, ride a bike and so on and so on and so on. But in the overall view, are we doing well? And because it's not just up to the people, but also up to the really economy and the up to the capital, how could one force, like how realistic is it to force companies to do well? Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks for the questions.
Perhaps I can add one more to that, which is related to capitalism, no? Because this is probably also what, at least how I understood your last part of the question. So it's people, yes, but it's also kind of the system and the incentives we give. Perhaps you can say some words on that. And is there anything more? Otherwise, I would ask Daniele to reply. Okay, no. So
maybe I will start from the last questions, and sorry if I've overcomplicated the explanation. But basically, for both green growth and degrowth or post-growth, they have the same goals, which are on one side to enhance well-being, and on the other side to stay within environmental boundaries. Of course, this is on paper. What they differ is how to get there. So green growth says that the way to achieve both environmental protection and well-being is to use green growth. So we then use growth to improve health, education, and on the other hand, technologies will improve also the environment. On the other hand, what degrowth says is that with growth, there is no way that we will stay within environmental boundaries, and we don't even need growth to improve well-being. What we need to do is to distribute more the resources that we have, especially in high-income countries. So the point I was trying to make is that, for example, this life expectancy and health that I was looking at are not specific goals, but they are within kind of the well-being overall goal of both green growth and degrowth. But basically, they have the same formally they have the same goals. They just differ on how we should achieve them, and probably they also differ on what they think well-being is. So of course, green growth think well-being is something different than what degrowth thinks well-being is. So this was in a bit of in a nutshell. And as examples, so I didn't put it here, but there is a very nice chart that is usually used that shows that there are just 2 or 3 countries that have reached very high human development, means very high health and education quality, with not polluting the environment too much. And one of the cases that usually used is Costa Rica, for example. And the other countries in Latin America also are used as examples that reach some social indicators with low growth. But I think overall there is no real model that is advocated as the model to follow, that is like the perfect example to follow. There are some countries that do good things in some way and others in other way, but there is no kind of golden standard to follow. But I mean, I totally agree, and I'm actually very interested in hearing your opinion about what you call the bubble in Cologne, or these kind of arguments, which I think are critical. And then going to Jana's point, I think that the main issue of, I mean, the issues of realizing degrowth or post-growth are mainly 2. The first one is, and I think is the most sensitive one, is actually what we do in countries like Germany or Italy and the US has huge repercussions in countries in Africa or Asia. As we see now, for example, already, the fact that we consume less or the markets are disrupted is creating huge problems to farmers, for example, in Africa and other countries. So we need to think about degrowth, just not in terms of what we do, but also what are the consequences to people in other countries, also because we have caused the majority of the emissions and climate disruptions, and we have in a way used other countries to feed our consumption. So we should not be selfish not to think about the consequences of what we do are on other countries. And I think this is the most critical issue. On the other hand, the issue of countries that some agree and some don't agree on this, I think this is actually a bit of a less an issue than
you are not here to hear. I mean, at least I cannot hear you, and I think others can't hear you as well. So I think it's your internet. Perhaps we can just wait until you're back. It's Daniele, okay? Mm-hmm. So hopefully he'll be back. Perhaps in the meantime, are there any questions, new questions? Or comments? I mean, you can also follow up on answers that have been given. Now he fully left the picture, but I hope he's going to be back. I think he is back somehow. But now. I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, there we go. I think you're back, Daniela, right? At least you're starting the screen sharing. Not again. And you're muted. You could start by unmuting yourself, then we can hear you. We don't need the screen right now. This would be an option. In the meantime, perhaps, Christian, is there anything on YouTube that we should consider?
Thanks. No, currently not. But I was thinking perhaps you could tell something about the Deutsche Institut für Entwicklungspolitik.
In order to make some those advertisement things in between.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit about the background, where like how all this came to online to the stream.
Yeah. So.
Can you hear me?
Thank you so much. I don't have to talk about the GDI. Christian just proposed I'll just blank spots with some advertisement on our institute. But I prefer you continue talking.
But was it me or was all this thing?
Bad internet.
But was it me disappearing?
Yes, you disappeared. There was bad internet, I guess. But now you reconnect,
Okay.
and you can hear us, yeah. But it seems, do you hear me? No, I think it's your internet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ah, oh, you're back. Even with the screen.
Yeah. But yeah,
Somehow,
I can hear you very well, and
you're just not reacting. Okay. Yeah, we didn't hear you, so
okay.
I think there is a delay, actually, me talking and you listening. Yes, there is. But you can just continue if you want.
Mm. Okay, no, I mean, I hear the questions, but I will just, so now we go, yeah.
So I think I found it very interesting what you said to the, and I think this is something we should, or I'd like to discuss later, the impact that it has if we reduce our consumption when we go, when we go into a degrowth world here in some Western countries. What impact does it have on other countries that are actually dependent on our consumption and way of working? But I'm still missing the link to capitalism. Okay, I think I don't hear you.
Should I go now? Or do you want to discuss later on?
As you want.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think there's always like a break. Okay, now
okay, let's maybe do the presentation and then.
Yeah, but you have to, I mean, there are always skips in between where I don't hear you. Let's try to start and see whether it works, okay?
Okay, just nod with your head if it's going well, or say no with your head. Do you want to, should I try to reconnect?
Yes. Yes. You try to reconnect. I'll use this as an advertisement for the German Development Institute, the Deutsche Institut für Entwicklungspolitik. So actually, Daniele is a colleague of mine. So I'm also working there. So it's an institute that does a lot of research in order to then use that as policy advice. So we try to put things simple into very practical messages that can then be taken up. We see that it has actually a lot to do with personal relationships. So whether you know somebody at certain institutions or not. So our primary kind of recipients are people at the BMZ, which is the Ministry for Economic Development. So our Entwicklungsministerium. And yeah, it has a lot to do of, so whether they listen to you, whether they understand you, whether they ask you to feed information in, has a lot to do with whether they understand what you're working on, whether they trust you, if there is a personal relationship. So this is something interesting to learn, because most of us come from university. So also Daniele, he did his PhD in Manchester. So most did their PhDs somewhere and then come to the institute and then kind of have to learn how to adapt their language and the questions they ask sometimes as well, and the feedback they get from policymakers to their work. We work on very different topics, all related to some kind of development. But I mean, then we can ask ourselves, what is development? And this is something that Daniele does. No, what is well-being? So how can we enhance well-being? Is it only economic growth? How does that translate into well-being of people? Because there is a lot of, you call it non-inclusive growth, for example, where it's actually not triggered down to yeah, Daniele just writes me that he tries to reconnect, I guess. So where it's not trickling down to the people that actually need the growth, no? So while you see a lot of growth, for example, in India and China, I'm not an expert on those countries, but just to give you kind of rough examples, there is a lot of high GDP growth, not right now, but generally, but it's not, but at the same time, you have a lot of poor people because the growth up there does not reach the people down here, and you have an increase in inequality of wealth and well-being there. So this is something we intensively work on. Generally, right now, there's also a lot of, that's quite nice, current columns coming out. So these are kind of one pages that try to relate our research to the current crisis, to COVID. So there has been a nice column, for example, written on how this is related to climate change. Can we use this current situation in order to also now impose certain restrictions on the economy and change behavior of people to have a longer term change in our economic structure? And this is also kind of related to what we're talking about today. I kind of feel like I have to talk a lot now that I didn't plan for. You can also ask questions and I'll try to answer them if you have some. You can raise your hand if you want to say something. Yeah, I can tell you something about my research. So I'm working in the field of flight and migration. So on why do people leave their homes and are forced to leave their homes most often. And it's also quite interesting is the wrong word, shocking to see how this relates to COVID, because it's the most vulnerable population in most countries. And most of the refugees and migrants worldwide live in countries of African countries, so they don't leave the continent. They live in still very poor countries because they just move across the border, for example, and stay there in camps. And those camps don't have any sanitary or hygienic measures in order to prevent them from spreading the virus once it's there. And also social distancing doesn't work there. There is no possibility of because they have very small houses, if they have a house, so it's the entire family in there and you can't keep them in there and not, come to other places where you spread the infection, for example, when there is food or water distributed in camps. And at the same time, people don't trust the government nor any officials up there because they have lived through very bad times and have experienced that they cannot trust them. So if they tell them to distance themselves or that there's something bad happening, they don't believe this. And we see that, for example, our borders are closed, no? So people cannot move to other countries anymore. And there are lots of seasonal laborers in many regions of the world. I mean, one very practical example we see here is with how are they called, in order to get our Spargel out of the earth. So seasonal workers there. And this is also the case in many other countries in the world, in very poor countries in the world that use the migration from one country to the other to support their families. And now they cannot do that anymore. Yes, and I now...
May I ask you a question about this?
Yes, sure.
So I know we call them, these people who collect like our Spargel, they are still coming like to our country, right? Because so for them, the borders are still open. But I know, I mean, I don't have a full picture on the situation like in Lesbos, but I heard that the conditions are like really bad.
Yes.
What's the motivation or what's the argument by the politicians at the moment that they don't get like people from there like to Germany, for example, when they, I mean, like for our Spargel people, they still can come to Germany, but the other one. So what do you know? I don't have a full picture at the moment at that one. Maybe.
Yeah, I think it's a very political situation. So it has been discussed for months now to take at least, you know, I don't know. At the beginning, I think it was about 1,500 kids. No?
Yeah.
And then it was to 50 or something. Ah, you're back.
Yeah, I'm using my phone network because I don't know what's going on with my internet at home.
I'm sorry to hear that. Can you?
So maybe I will keep the video off and just share the slides.
Okay,
that might work.
Share the slides. Let me just finish the one question. Ah, yeah, perfect. Well, I can. Bina, I don't know your real name. Probably, I don't know if you called
Ben. And we can discuss it like some other time. I just wanted to,
let's do that.
Let's continue with the presentation.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay.
Anyway, this shows why I'm not a fan of green growth, because technology will never solve all our problems.
Nice. So I would suggest you go ahead now with, now we have a session with very practical examples, which I think is very helpful for all of us to think about what we can do. And then of about 10 to 15 minutes, I guess. And then we open the floor again for discussions and questions.
Yeah, so sorry again for all the technical issues. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I just want to kind of show you some practical proposals that have been done in different parts of Europe, and basically shows the link between degrowth and coronavirus. So I will start with three main proposals. One was the proposal was made to the Council of Barcelona 3-4 years ago, and they basically structured their proposal around 10 points, which have different policies. So the first policy that they advocated for was debt audit, which means that the reasoning behind this was they thought that the issue with growth is that also we need to grow to reduce the debt that we have at the moment, and they think that people should do kind of public audits to try to cut debt, especially of low-income households, but this should be done in a democratic way. So this was the first kind of policy they aim for. The second one, and the one that is very much shared by all the growers, is about work sharing. So the issue of reducing work week, for example, they said at a maximum 32 hours. And what they also want to do is that to increase the wages of the low-income earners in a way so they don't actually lose money, and they actually want to decrease the wages of the top earners. So basically they want to reduce working hours, make sure that the low earners don't lose money, and this reform will be paid by taxing more the earnings of the very rich people. The third proposal is to do both the basic and a maximum income. So in Barcelona, they proposed a basic income of around 500 euros per month. And they said that there should be maximum income that should not go above 30 times this basic income. So people would need to earn a maximum 15,000 euros per month. So this is the maximum income. The fourth is a sort of green tax reform. So to basically change taxation by taxing more consumption, especially environmental damaging consumption, and tax less labor. And especially have a very high tax rates of around 90% for the highest incomes in society. A fifth one is something that actually has been already happening in many countries, is to not stop subsidizing fossil fuels and other environmental polluting resources, and use the money more for improvements of, for example, public spaces, maybe increase cycling lanes and subsidize public transport. So this was the number 5. Number 6 is probably mostly linked to what also we could do in our neighborhoods, because it's about supporting the solidarity society and alternative society, which means tax exemptions and especially laws for non-profit and cooperatives and networks, alternative networks for healthcare and shared housing. So this is something maybe we already see in some of our neighborhoods. The 7th one is more about building. So if possible, stop the construction of new houses. So stop this kind of growing housing stock and have very high taxes on second houses and buildings that are not fully occupied. Then the 8th one is something that is very interesting also, is that one of the main pillars of degrowth is they want to reduce advertising, because they advocate that that's what actually drives consumption. And they always make the case of the example of Grenoble in France, where I think around 2014, they took out advertising from more than 400 public spaces and they replaced them with trees or with gardens. And for them, advertising is really one of the issues that degrowth should address. Then the last 2 are about kind of more measurements issues. So one is that they were proposing for Catalonia, for example, a maximum number of emissions per year. So they have a clear target of what they can emit every year. And the last one is another core degrowth issue, is about not using GDP as an indicator of economic progress. So they did not actually propose a specific alternative indicator, but they said that it would be something more related to health and education, like the Human Development Index that is used by the UN, but they have not proposed one. But the main point was to move away from GDP. So as you can see, it's very different policies. And in sort of the same framework, there was this proposal made by left parties and some economists in Austria that was based on fewer points, so 6 points, but you can see that there are a lot of similarities with the previous example of Catalonia. So one was, again, reducing working hours by 10%, and also here increasing wages to make people not lose money, especially for the lower income households. Again, here, eco-social tax reforms, which means, again, increasing taxing environmental bad consumption and taxing less labor, and especially they advocate here cost neutral. So you use the revenues from taxing carbon or pollution in order to finance more socially, lower, for example, income taxes and financial more social outcomes. Linked to that is the reduction of fossil fuel subsidies. Then again, the promotion of sustainable consumption, and within this proposal, there is also here decreased advertisement. Then there is here subsidies if people have a positive environmental behavior, and their main example was to increase subsidies to public transportation. And then the last one, more for industries, is that they were advocating for very tight regulations on production and how efficient the production should be. So I hope that these 2 kind of examples gave you a taste of what some policies are advocated. Now, the issue is that the policies that I proposed to you, that I showed, and that are kind of aimed by degrowth, are mainly top-down policies. So are policies that economists or policies that researchers or civil society are trying to push with the governments. But there are also examples of bottom-up policies. So policies that we can also start to do within our life or within our neighborhoods, or within our families, that I can actually start a process of towards a degrowth or post-growth society. And I've here outlined just a few of them. Some of them are quite obvious, like the first 2, for example, consume less energy or producing less waste. Others are actually, I find them very interesting. So one, for example, is promoting current community currencies. And I've experienced this when I was living in England, in Bristol, and we had the local currency for Bristol, which means that you exchange your British pound with a currency where you can buy goods from local shops, and that worked very well for Bristol. So I found it a very interesting proposal, but mostly I think proposals are around making the community and the neighborhood much more important than global ties. So living much more in your community and exchanging and buying products that come from your community and very close to you. And I think, and the last part of this bottom-up proposal are about the way we live our lives. So degrowth promotes kind of a life where you share more spaces, where you live a more frugal life. So you consume less, but you spend more time doing things, and especially with people that you care about. So it's less about materialistic consumption, is more about what you do and who you spend your time with. And this is linked also to the issue, to some top-down policies, because, for example, some argue, yes, you are basically making people work less, but you are also making them not lose money. So one could say that now that you have more time, you can actually buy more things and actually have the same environmental footprint. But actually, what the growers would say is that if you have very high taxation on consumption, people would not spend that money on environmental polluting goods, but we spend the time doing other things. So that's how a bit the debate is going to be between degrowth and opposites of degrowth. But I guess that the point I want to make that degrowth involves different type of policies that we're seeing. So we have environmental policies, which come from taxes, from caps on emissions. We have economic policies, especially working hours or different currencies, or more communal property lifestyle. And we have especially much more importance on relationship and social movements. And of course, there is also the issue of commercial media and advertising. But the most important thing is that to actually achieve the growth, what is said is that you need to achieve or implement these policies together. So if you implement just some of them, we will not achieve the sustainable degrowth that was at the core of the definition that we saw at the first slide. And that's why every policy package that I presented you has all these different policies together. So in a way, I would maybe at the end I will be interested in knowing what you kind of think about these policies, and if you have experiences with these policies in your kind of current life, as I had with the local currency in Bristol. That would be very interesting for me. And probably now it's good if I continue this before we go in the last discussion. So the last point I want to explore was, why are we in a situation where if we actually want to push for post-growth and degrowth, we should actually take advantage of this, of course, tragic situation, but maybe this could also be a silver line for a kind of different future. And I've identified four, I mean, not I, but there are 4 reasons that can corroborate this. The first thing is that we can see in the next years, there is a lot of forecast of contractions of GDP. So some say 3, some say 5, others even say 10% contraction of GDP in the next 10 years. So of course, degrowth is something that we will, in a way, experience anyway in the next years, and they could also be long-term. So it could be 2 years, 3 years, but could also be longer. So it's something that we anyway have to plan around. The second point is that following one of the hypotheses that I presented before about degrowth, decreases in economic growth have been strongly associated with decreases in pollution. So here I put 2 maps. On the left, China, and on the right, Italy and other parts of Europe. And the left part of each of the 2 figures is before coronavirus, so when production was at its normal rate, and the right part was when production was disrupted from coronavirus. And as you can see, there is an incredible difference of pollution and emissions, showing how actually coupled GDP growth and pollution are. So this kind of, again, gives more credibility to the hypothesis of degrowth. A third point important is that we have that there are signs, even though it's not been proved, that environmental degradation is also claimed to be responsible for the coronavirus crisis. And again, here it could give more push towards environmental regulations. And then the fourth point is something that is actually an ongoing process that has no comparable moment in the last 40 years, is that the redistributive policies, which are showed in some of the proposals beforehand, have been widely implemented in the last month. So I put here, you can see on the left, between the 20th of March and the 24th of April, there were 151 countries that have planned social protection measures or redistributive policies in response to coronavirus, which is an incredible amount for just such a short time period. And on the right, you can see that the overall increase of the size of these policies has been of 86%. So basically the size of these policies that the government are spending almost doubled in just 1 month. And this is incredible, as governments until before coronavirus were advocating actually to contract social protection policies for reasons of fiscal austerity. And they've actually shown that if you give priority to these policies, you can very well enhance the budget for them. So this is a fourth reason where kind of the growth can be pushed. And also linked to what I said and linked to all these points, last week, a group of Dutch researchers and scholars has proposed to the government a coronavirus manifesto for a post-coronavirus development model. And as you can see here, some of the points go again in the direction of degrowth. Just to show you how, again, coronavirus has been linked by many towards a post-growth world. The first thing they advocated for was, again, going away from the issue of GDP growth, and especially differentiate between good and bad sectors. Then again, they look at a framework and a type of society focused on redistribution, so very progressive taxation, especially on profits and wealth, and job sharing and less working hours. They look towards agricultural transformation, especially more for environmental reason. Again, they look at the reduction of consumption from high-income individuals, so especially of travel, of air travel, especially, and luxury goods. And then another point, which we have touched upon in the previous slides, and especially in the proposal from Barcelona, was about debt cancellation. So again, it's a mix of economic, social, and environmental policy, and the Dutch government is considering this as a kind of way forward. And in a way, similar things can be found in the Green New Deal that was proposed in November and December, even that was much more conservative than these proposals. Now, before finishing, I also want to touch about the issue of low and middle income countries that we discussed before, just to touch on some concepts. So as I said before, in a way, we need to be careful of the consequences for degrowth for lower and middle income countries. On a positive note, of course, if we reduce our economic growth and economic output, we free space for low and middle income countries to grow, and they can use more environmental resources as we decrease our use. But of course, as I said before, there is a lot of links between economies, so they will be hurt by less exports to European and other high-income countries. And also, they might also be not in favor of degrowth and themselves when they actually grow, because they can see this as a conservative throwback towards the past. And also for them, it's very difficult to implement degrowth or anywhere redistributive policies in the short term because they don't have social protection system as established as ours, even though, as you've seen, a lot of countries now are taking steps into that direction. And so to sort of bridge these problems between degrowth in advanced economies and what happens in low middle income countries, there are three steps or some steps that international cooperation can take. The first one is cancel debt levels, and this is also something that has been anyway proposed by many during this coronavirus crisis. The second is that we need to find a way, and this is a big kind of source of controversy in the climate talks, about how industrial countries or high-income countries need to repay for the damage created from industries. And the third thing, as Diana was pointing out, we need to find a way to avoid rebound consumption. So find a way to kind of make everything join and not make the effort that who joins are cancelled by efforts of countries that do not join this new development path, and then they consume more. So what I was trying to say here is that development cooperation is to have a clear role to guide anyway new development models, and especially to link kind of social and environmental outcomes. I think I will stop here, and here I propose some also discussion points that we can think about. So I would like, with constraints of time, to hear your ideas about post-growth, and especially if you think that this is possible in Germany. As I said also before, also maybe discuss if something similar is happening, you think in your life or in your neighborhood, or what additional proposal you would have apart from the ones that I was pointing out in the presentation. And I think I will stop here.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Daniela. That was, again, highly interesting, I guess, to all of us, and also gives us a lot of food for thoughts of what we can do. I have one question from the YouTube chat, but I'd also like to ask the people here in the Zoom meeting to raise their hands or say something if you don't know how to raise your hands. Yes, Bene, to ask questions, and then we collect some. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks a lot for your talk. I have one question on this community currency that I didn't understand fully the concept of it. It's like the advantage that you spend like your money like on in a local neighborhood, or what is the idea behind it?
Okay.
Sure. Collect or
should I collect some questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
Then Karen.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, because you mentioned rebound consumerism in a scenario where some countries participate maybe in a model and some others don't, but could you also imagine that we face a rebound consumerism now after the worst of COVID-19 is over, that then there's so much advertisement being pushed out, so many price reductions being pushed out to just get economy going again, that we have a similar effect here?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Anything else from inside the meeting here? Yes, Ami and Thomas.
Hi, thank you. I just got the question, if you also consider levels of education in all these models, because all these ways, like to improve our consumption patterns or all these things, they are related to our education level. If we don't understand, for example, what a new currency will, which change will bring about or something, or how our behavior is related to, I don't know, to everything in the world, how we harm the nature, how we harm the animals, and so on and so on. Do you consider, education in the theories? And linked to that, I got one very direct question about the green growth model. When technological change should help us to improve. I just wonder if we could rely on technology, because it's changing very fast. And actually the trend is to change to green energy, which is kind of getting energy from wind or sun or whatever, and then we are building and constructing some things, which also the construction of all these things and panels will also have some negative impacts. Can politicians really do politicians really understand what technology will bring about? Sorry, I hope this question.
No, it's a great question, and something that I think is very relevant.
And I would just add the question from YouTube and then give it back to you.
Mm-hmm.
So on YouTube, it's asked whether there are any political groups of the European Parliament which argue for degrowth, and where do you look in traditional national legislation and ideologies?
Very, very insightful and very deep questions, I would say. So I will start with the one about the local currency. So you're right in a way that and sorry for not explaining myself clearly. So the local currency, the idea or the aim behind it is that people should consume from local shops and local production. So for example, when I was in Bristol, the idea is that you exchange pounds for the local currency, but of course, if you spend with the local currency, you also have slightly lower prices, which is something that, of course, is done to also stimulate more the use of this local currency. But you're right that the aim is to stimulate and consume from local shops. So that was the main idea. Then going to the issue of rebound, that's a very good question. And to be honest, I am very pessimistic a bit in your view. So I think we not much has changed in order to kind of, once we go back to kind of normal life, if that happens soon, I think things will go back as they were before, and we might have also a rebound. And that's why a lot of people are pushing now for measures that were advocated from the Green New Deal to be implemented way before what was planned when the plan came out in December. Because if we don't take advantage now, then it might be too late. But in a way, I share, if you were pessimist, then I share your pessimism. But I think as it is now, if things go back and if the lockdown finishes quite soon, then I think we are not in a position where actually we can avoid rebound and going back to where we were. So sorry for this pessimistic number.
Just quickly, perhaps some people don't know about the Green New Deal. Perhaps you can say some words about it.
So yeah, the Green New Deal was a plan that was pointed out, that was presented in December by the European Commission, where there is a pathway to make Europe emission neutral for 2050. And this is the first time that, so this is not legal yet, but it aimed to be legal by the summer, I think. And this is the first time, of course, a plan like this with kind of a legal framework is pushed. Of course, there are people, many say that this is not enough because we should aim to have much stricter requirements for 2030 and not 2050. But also, on a positive way, it gives a framework where we can also justify, especially in a moment like today, pushing for more green measures and green policies. But if you want any more information on that, also feel free to email me and I can send you some documents or interesting article about it. Okay, so maybe I'll go back to the other question. So the other one was about the level of education. I don't have an answer in a way that all these theories consider education as crucial, But I think to address your point about how to understand like changes, I think that the key policy more than education is about reducing working time. Because one of the also another hypothesis is that people work too much or don't have actually time to kind of think or kind of to reason, and so having a bit kind of less work time and getting more perspective in life and thinking a bit more and doing more what you what you want and what you like is in a way to understand kind of the changes that are necessary for a post-growth society. So it's a bit an interaction of more education, but also having more time not working and kind of more time to kind of really think about life and about your priorities and about what you want to achieve in life. I don't know whether that was a full answer to your question. And then about the one about technology. So I think we should not rely on technology, but technology needs to be a definitely part of the future. So for example, also degrowth does not advocate against technology. Degrowth advocates against relying just on technologies. So they say that we should not pollute as much as we can now, waiting for these technologies that then will suck all the pollution and the CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. They say that we should continue to explore technologies that make our life more environmentally efficient, but this will not be enough to reach the target of becoming neutral by 2050. So we should accompany this more environmental friendly technologies with also reduction in energy and emissions by consuming less. So in a way, technology is also present in degrowth, but is not the thing we would rely on. And I think also considering kind of your last remark about politicians and technology, I share your point that I think a lot of times we try to second technology or spur technology without actually thinking or reasoning what technology is and if we really need that technology. So sometimes I think we think that innovations are good just because there are innovations, and I think we should maybe think more carefully what type of innovations we want and what type of technologies we want. And the last point was about political parties in Europe. So yes, there is a big, not a big, but there is an increasing movement of degrowth proponents in Europe. Is not proposed by a single political party, but is an alliance of politicians that belong to different parties across different countries in Europe. And they've also advanced a proposal to the European Commission, but it was not well structured. And so that's why I'm not presented, because it's not very clear on the policy outcomes that they want to achieve. But again, I can share that with you if you want.
Great. Thank you, Daniele. There is a question by Christian.
By the way, sorry, I'm putting my email here in case you want to email
Yeah,
me.
we can share it. Yeah, we can also share it somehow. Ah, yeah, there it is. Perfect. So you're gonna get a lot of spams now.
My colleagues.
Yes. Christian, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much. So this morning there was an interview in a German newspaper, Die Tageszeitung, with Nico Pech from the University of Siegen, also about post-growth economy. And he said that digitalization is one of the main drivers for all modern crises and also for the current crisis, and argues that digitalization in general should be tackled. He doesn't really underline it with a lot of arguments. So it made me feel that in the current situation, the digital world actually gives us alternatives to see friends, to talk tonight, for example. So if we push out this argument that digitalization is bad, so in drastic words, I feel that could also lose some support for post-growth or degrowth movement. And I was just wondering about your thoughts on this topic.
Okay.
Are there any more questions within this meeting? Zoom meeting? Raise your hand. Sometimes I seem to not see it, so then you should also just speak up. Okay, if not, then I would have some more. So one is, what's your perspective on how to best, or I mean, perhaps this is also something we can jointly discuss. Yes, Marion, you're then the next in line to talk. I wonder, I mean, this degrowth, the things that degrowth says we should do, or very specific policies on it, kind of stand in contrast, or at least they can be perceived as that, to quick enhance, you know, economic recovery afterwards, because you would have to take some other measures now, and it might harm big companies that provide a big chunk of growth and employment in Germany. So I wonder how all of us perhaps think of how politically feasible this is now, because then, I mean, there are some people who propose it, no? For example, Schäuble, I think, said something about it on the Tagesschau, on the German newspaper, or news services, yesterday or the day before, that we have to, you know, think about restructuring certain aspects of our economy. But then, you know, those people are immediately attacked by those ones that now say, okay, we already are in such a economic downturn, and this is not the time to push those policies now. So what do you think, or do, you know, other people here think could be nice arguments or a way forward to actually change some very structural components? And then I'd ask Marion to speak up now. We cannot, yeah, now we can.
Thank you, Jana. So my question is related to the last question that you had on your last slide, Daniela, where you asked us, what are we already doing, or what can we do to live a, let's say, greener life? And this is a question I asked myself some time back, and then there's a test for the ecological footprint you can do, and then all these questions are asked, like, where do you buy your vegetables, and which kind of housing do you live, like the very practical things we all try to do. And I think Amy asked a question related to this earlier. So we all try to live a very ecological life. But I think what I realized was that the things I can do are very small, and they have very, very little impact, because the pure fact that we are living in a industrialized high-income country means that we are kind of consuming, like we would need like 2 or 3 worlds to kind of live the living standard we are currently living. And that's mostly because of the infrastructure and the industry that's around us, where I don't really feel I have any impact on it. So my question is, do you know what can we as individuals really do to have the highest impact to reduce carbon emissions? Thank you.
Okay, so I would suggest that take your time to answer, or other people can also then comment on it.
Should I start then? Maybe I'll start with the last one, and I will answer in a very practical terms and in a sort of idealistic dream talking terms. So in a practical term, the best thing we can do, for example, to decrease our footprint is to avoid flying. So basically, flying back and forth from Germany to New York 1.5 times is the entire carbon budget that we have for 1 year. And for example, average people in Germany have like 15 times, or between 10 and 15 times the carbon budget that we should have individually, and flying, for those who fly, makes a huge difference. And of course, other things can be being vegetarian or being vegan, but this, of course, is a very simplistic answer. From a dream talking perspective, I totally in a way, I totally agree with your point that sometimes it feels overwhelming to try to address these huge problems on your own individually. But I actually think that we as individuals, we should not aim to solve the problem, but actually we should just aim to put our brick towards this construction of a new development model. And if you look, for example, at examples like Greta, I know it's a very extreme example, but just by acting by you preach, or like doing something, you can then have a chain reaction that then can influence other people. If you influence, for example, your family or your friends with these good practices, then I think this can have a snowball effect. And then, social movements, many of them start like that. So in a way, I agree with your pessimism. In the other way, I also think that if we really try, I think we can really push for changes in the long term. So this was my sleepwalking response. The other question was, Jana, I forgot about the other questions. Digitalization. Actually, that's interesting because I haven't read any articles talking about digitalization in the experience with the coronavirus. I would have thought actually that the response would have been a positive one. So digitalization helps in this crisis more than causes them. But then I think that in a way, digitalization is probably part of one of the fundamental bad points or things that degrowth want to address, because digitalization has a lot to do also with the ownership of capital and people and firms that have a lot of capital, like Mark Zuckerberg or others. Of course, they also have a lot of power, and that, of course, goes against the democratic and social principles of degrowth, and also about the issue about the quality of inequality. So in a way, I see the issue of digitalization, but more as a relation to post-growth than the current coronavirus crisis. And then I forgot the last question.
Sorry, that was I think my question, which is on the political feasibility, when you have on the one hand, now after post-COVID, the aim to increase economic growth immediately, and implement strategies that might harm that, at least for certain parts of the economy we live in right now.
Yeah, so that's a very tricky thing to say. I think we should push, I mean, if people that support this kind of new development model, so to grow less and share more, I think pushing degrowth as less GDP, I think is the wrong strategy. I think I would push towards two other parallel paths, and then of course converge into the degrowth agenda. One is about environmental issues, so push again for the Green New Deal, which was proposed before, has a very established empirical framework, and is backed by a lot of data and models, and it's very much accepted also at the political level. And so this is one thing. And the other thing is just to show how, as I showed you one of the slides before, in just 1 month of coronavirus crisis, a lot of measures that were thought, that were proposed by degrowth have been implemented. For example, many places are doing work sharing, so people are working less. We have a lot of redistributive policies that have been implemented also middle income countries, and people are spending time differently. And maybe, I mean, a apart from the environmental issue, also kind of showing that this is actually possible, I think is another way of pushing towards post-growth. But personally, I would not push post-growth through just saying that growth is not good, because that would, I think, backfire politically. And the political economy of big firms and capitalism is way too strong to kind of be dealt through that way. But I would just go sidelines, looking at the environmental and inequality issues that I mentioned before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But if, I mean, if you have other views on that, I would be very happy to hear them.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts, but let's ask again. If there is, first of all, Christian, is there anything in the YouTube chat that we should answer or take into account?
No, but we still have 15 viewers.
Wow.
Yep. So hi to everyone out there.
Wonderful. Okay, so there are no questions from that side. Is there anything here? Marion, I still see your hand raised, but I think that's still because from previous asking of question. Any other comments? No? Okay. So I wonder whether we should leave it with that here, because people, I guess, tend to tired. And I would suggest, so if there are no questions now coming up, I mean, we can always discuss further. And you have Daniela's email address. So what I would suggest at this point is, for me at least, I would find it very, very helpful to have a follow-up, if it's something on Zoom here or whatever structure of meeting we'll have, to collect very like kind of, I'm just a bit confused because Stefan is doing something here to get more alcohol. I guess. So to collect some very specific activities and points that we can do in our own lives, but perhaps also to support politically. So I have listened to a podcast where some initiatives or some very specific political measures were mentioned that we could all support now and push our local politicians to, you know, bring into the debate, or I don't know, voice our opinions in the media. So we all do have those options, and but I'd like to have kind of a joint discussion on what we find most feasible, and then perhaps Kreativkollektiv Ehrenfeld can have kind of a joint manifesto on what we think very practically we can actually do. I don't know what you think about that, but we could discuss that. I'd like that. Marion is raising her hands, and then yes, please.
Yes, thanks again, Jana. So I think that's a bit related to the question I had earlier, because I would like to add, and what's most impactful, because I mean, our time is limited, our energy is limited. So I would be really keen in having a list on those things that have most impact and cost very little in terms of time and energy that we invest, so we can have the highest impact.
Yeah,
that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want, I can think about a sort of living document to be shared, and we can then take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like that. And Karen, you've just raised your hand, but now you unraised it. Do you want to say something?
I did that accidentally, actually, but or maybe I just wanted to say, yeah, I support the idea of collecting this best practice advice, so to say. Totally on board with that.
Cool. Kata?
Yeah, that was basically the same here. I had some, I just wanted to say that I also support the idea of kind of having a follow-up and maybe summarize the initiatives or the things that are possible that we can do in our everyday life, and also the way we can support the policies, or or we can transport it into politics and little initiatives, and that sort of thing.
And Ami and Thomas, or Amy, sorry, I don't really know how to pronounce your name.
Hi, Ami was right. Thank you, Jana. Oh, but no, I need the camera. Ich brauche die Kamera. I wanted to, I think this is a good idea to have a follow-up, and I wanted to also give you two things, to recommend you a book and a documentation that inspired me a lot. They are quite old, like 3 to 4 years old. The one documentation is called Tomorrow. You maybe heard of that. It got very famous, got a lot of publicity. And the other book is called, I just got the German version. It's called Utopien für Realisten.
Yeah, that I know.
You know that?
Is that from the guy who was at Davos?
It's a journalist.
He just brought out a new book.
Netherlands. His name is Rutger Bregman.
Yeah, he got a lot of attention because he was questioning this capitalistic work.
Yeah. I think especially Jana will like this book.
Good.
And yeah, he's really questioning the system and everything around, and making a lot of very, very good ideas, like the 15-hour week and so on, reducing working time, and a lot of good ideas. And also giving good examples how to, when was it implemented well, in which countries or in which cities. It's
perfect.
Giving both of these are giving a lot of hope. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I just perhaps to add on that, if you haven't seen that, but I haven't read it, I've just read in the Zeit that he has just published a new book, which has something to do with Menschenbilder, human, I don't have the translation right in hand now, but yes, yeah, perhaps you've seen it already. Daniela, you want to say something?
No, I mean, I just want to clarify that in a way, like, I'm not a degrowth scholar in a way that's not my kind of research that I do daily, but I do agree, and I do believe on the issues of changing our development path and a lot of things, that ideas that degrowth stands for. So that's why I think the motivation for this talk was just to kind of share some principles of degrowth and try to find, for me, the important thing is trying to find ways where we can actually apply this principle and bring this kind of theory into practice. And it's great that many people also are interested in these issues.
Yeah, so then this is the perfect line to jump in and thank you again. I think it's just wonderful that you took your time to explain basic concepts to all of us and to give examples of where it or how it could work, which pathways to think about. And I think this is now, as we just talked about, a wonderful starting point to not end the discussion here, but to keep it going, kick it off. And I mean, we can discuss among us to what would be the best format, if it's a living document where all of us, can put something in there, or if we have another round of discussion, then what we can actually do in order to push these policies, this rethinking. And I'm just seeing that there is one last YouTube question. Should be an easy one, but I don't think it's good for you, because what would be the German translation of degrowth?
Postwachstum.
Postwachstum, yeah, I would say the same. So there's no difference between post-growth and growth then in the German translation.
In Germany, yeah, post-growth is used more than the kind of subsection like degrowth, A-growth, or a steady state economy. So I would just say post-vaccine.
Post-vaccine, yeah. So I hope this answers the question in YouTube. And then I would close the session now, or this meeting. Thank you all. So not only thank you to Daniele, but thank you for like being interested in that topic in on YouTube, and also joining the meeting here and posing your questions and comments. I think that's always important.
And sorry very much again for the technical issues.
Well, I mean, just clarifies that technology won't solve everything, right?
Exactly.
All right.